Picture a small-town pharmacy. The year is 1897. Wooden shelves, brass scales, the smell of camphor and dust. A woman walks in with cramps, or a cough, or a child who won't stop seizing. The pharmacist reaches up, past the laudanum and the headache powders, and pulls down a little glass bottle. The label reads, Cannabis Indica. It was made in Indianapolis by a company called Eli Lilly. The same Eli Lilly that today makes your insulin. Nobody whispers, nobody breaks a law. This is just medicine. The most boring transaction in the building. Now fast forward to a man being handcuffed on a city sidewalk for carrying the exact same plant. Same chemistry, same flower. The only thing that changed was us. So how did the single most ordinary product in the American medicine cabinet end up classified beside heroin as one of the most dangerous substances on earth? That question has a name, a villain, and a body count of wasted decades. And the answer is stranger than the propaganda films ever were. But this story doesn't start in a pharmacy. It starts thousands of years before anyone thought to make it illegal, back when cannabis was simply one of the most useful plants a human being could own. In ancient China, tradition credits the legendary emperor Shen Nung, the so-called father of Chinese medicine, with cataloging cannabis as a remedy somewhere around the year 2700 BCE. By the time of the Great Chinese Pharmacopeia, it was recommended for everything from rheumatism to malaria to absent-mindedness. Whether or not Shen Nung was a real man, the point stands. The Chinese were writing cannabis into their medical texts, while most of the world was still figuring out the wheel. Travel west, and you find it in ancient Egypt. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical scroll written around 1550 BCE, lists cannabis as a treatment for inflammation. Egyptian healers ground it into ointments thousands of years before aspirin existed. In India, it went deeper than medicine. The Atharva Veda, one of the sacred Hindu texts, named cannabis one of 5 sacred plants, a source of joy and a reliever of anxiety. Indian physicians used it for pain, for sleep, for digestion, woven into a healing tradition that's still practiced today. The ancient Greeks used it. The Romans used it. The physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century, described its uses in a text that doctors would lean on for the next 1500 years. Here's the thing worth sitting with for a second. For most of human civilization, across nearly every continent, cannabis wasn't controversial. It wasn't even interesting. It was a tool, like willow bark or honey or salt. So how did something this universal, this unremarkable, get rebranded as a menace? To understand that, we have to meet the man who dragged it into the modern world. In the 1830s, a young Irish doctor named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy was stationed in Calcutta, working for the British East India Company. He was brilliant, restless, and curious about the local medicine he saw all around him. Indian physicians had been using cannabis for centuries, and O'Shaughnessy decided to do something most Western doctors never bothered with. He studied it properly. He tested cannabis extracts on animals first, then on patients suffering from rheumatism, from rabies, from cholera, from tetanus. He watched it calm violent muscle spasms. He watched a baby racked with convulsions go still and finally rest. In 1839, he published his findings, and the medical world paid attention. O'Shaughnessy brought samples back to Britain, and that's when cannabis stopped being an exotic Eastern remedy and became a fixture of European medicine. Pharmacists began stocking it. Doctors began prescribing it. Within a couple of decades, you could walk into chemist shops across London and Paris and buy cannabis tinctures right off the shelf, and it climbed all the way to the top. Queen Victoria's personal physician was a man named Sir John Russell Reynolds, one of the most respected doctors in the British Empire. He used cannabis in his practice, and in 1890, he wrote in the medical journal, The Lancet, that when it came to certain kinds of pain, cannabis was among the most useful medicines he had ever worked with. It's long been said he prescribed it to the Queen herself for menstrual cramps. The royal records are quiet on that detail, so treat the gossip as gossip, but the bigger truth is solid. The most prestigious physician in Britain considered this plant a serious, valuable medicine, and he said so in print. in the most prestigious journal of his day. This was the high point of cannabis as ordinary medicine, respectable, royal adjacent, recommended by the experts. And it was about to cross the Atlantic and become a genuinely big business. By the second half of the 1800s, cannabis had become a staple of American medicine, and not in some fringe, back-alley way. The biggest, most trusted names in the country were making it. Eli Lilly sold it. Park Davis sold it. Squibb, the ancestor of the modern pharmaceutical giant, sold it. These companies produced cannabis tinctures, extracts, and pills by the ton, shipped to pharmacies in every corner of the nation. It went into cough remedies, painkillers, sleep aids, and corn plasters. It was even an ingredient in some of the patent medicines that traveling salesmen hawked from the back of wagons. In 1850, cannabis earned the ultimate stamp of legitimacy. It was added to the United States Pharmacopeia, the official national list of recognized, approved medicines. Think about that for a second. The federal government's own reference book of trusted drugs included cannabis, and it stayed on that list for the better part of a century. There were no warning labels screaming about addiction, no federal agents, no moral panic. A mother could buy a bottle of cannabis extract to ease her child's teething pain and think absolutely nothing of it, the same way you'd grab a bottle of cough syrup today. For roughly 70 years, this was simply normal life in America. Cannabis was as controversial as chamomile tea. So what happened? How does a country go from selling a plant in every pharmacy to throwing people in prison for it? The answer has almost nothing to do with the plant, and almost everything to do with fear, money, and one very ambitious man. This is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. In 1910, revolution broke out in Mexico. Over the following years, hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants crossed into the United States, settling across Texas, the Southwest, and beyond. They brought their culture, their food, their language, and a familiar custom of using the cannabis plant recreationally. They called it by its Spanish name, marijuana. And here is the detail that everyone misses. Most Americans had no idea that marijuana and the cannabis in their medicine cabinet were the exact same thing. The medicine had a respectable Latin name printed on a lily bottle. The immigrant's plant had a foreign-sounding name attached to people that newspapers were already teaching the public to distrust. That gap, that simple swapping of a word, became a weapon. During the Great Depression, with jobs scarce and resentment high, that resentment found an easy target. Newspapers began running lurid stories blaming marijuana for crime, for violence, for the supposed moral collapse of young people. The plant your grandmother trusted was suddenly being described as a poison that turned ordinary citizens into monsters. And the man who pumped gasoline on that fire owned more newspapers than anyone alive. William Randolph Hearst controlled a media empire that reached tens of millions of Americans. His papers were masters of what people called yellow journalism. Sensational, exaggerated, often invented, built to terrify and sell copies. And his pages overflowed with horror stories about marijuana, tales of people driven to madness and murder by a single dose. Were the stories true? Almost none of them. But truth was never the product. Fear was the product, and fear sold beautifully. There's a long-running theory that Hearst had business reasons too, that he held timber and paper interests threatened by hemp as a cheap competitor. Historians still argue about how much that actually drove him, but you don't need a conspiracy to explain the coverage. Sensational fear stories sold newspapers, and marijuana was a perfect villain, foreign, mysterious, and already tied in the public mind to people America was primed to fear. Then, in 1936, that fear got a face on the movie screen. A film originally titled Tell Your Children, later known as Reefer Madness, hit theaters. It showed clean-cut teenagers taking a few puffs and instantly spiraling into hysteria, hallucination, manslaughter, and suicide. It was so over the top that audiences today watch it for laughs. But in 1936, with no internet and no easy way to check the claims, plenty of people believed every frame. Public opinion was being engineered in real time. And waiting in the wings was a government official who understood exactly how to turn that manufactured panic into the law of the land. His name was Harry Anslinger, and in 1930 he was made the first commissioner of the brand new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger had a problem. Alcohol prohibition had just ended. His agency needed a mission, and he needed a dangerous enemy to justify his department's existence and budget. Marijuana became that enemy. Anslinger launched a relentless campaign. He kept files of grisly crime stories he blamed on the plant, many of them flimsy or completely unverified, and fed them to a hungry press. His public statements were soaked in the racial fear of the era, openly tying marijuana use to minority communities and to jazz musicians, and warning that it made users violent and unhinged. The claims were inflammatory, often invented, and aimed squarely at the gut rather than the brain. He testified before Congress. He went on the radio. He worked hand in glove with the same newspapers that had been printing the horror stories. And slowly, deliberately, he built a wall of public fear high enough to do what he really wanted: pass a federal law. By the mid-1930s, the machinery was all in place. The renaming, the newspapers, the film, the commissioner. The country had been carefully taught to fear a plant it had been buying at the pharmacy for almost 100 years. Anslinger was ready to make it official, and almost nobody was prepared to stand in his way. Almost nobody. If you're finding this as wild as I do, take a second and subscribe. This channel digs into the hidden histories behind the ordinary stuff we walk past every day, and there's a lot more where this came from. Now, back to 1937, and the one room where someone actually tried to stop all of this. By 1937, Anslinger pushed his masterstroke into Congress. It was called the Marihuana Tax Act. Officially, it didn't ban the plant outright. Instead, it wrapped cannabis in a tax and regulatory scheme, so heavy, so tangled, and so punishing that selling or even possessing it without the right government stamp became almost impossible. In practice, it criminalized the entire thing. The hearings were a farce. They were short, the testimony was thin, and much of the so-called evidence was the same recycled newspaper terror Anslinger had been feeding the public for years. But one man stood up and called it out. His name was Dr. William Woodward, and he was the legal counsel for the American Medical Association, the most powerful body of doctors in the country. Woodward sat before Congress and said, plainly, that the AMA opposed the bill. He pointed out that there was no real scientific evidence cannabis was the menace it was being made out to be. He noted that for nearly a century, American doctors had used it as legitimate medicine, and that this law would strangle a useful drug and shut down future research. He even called out the sneaky use of the word marijuana, arguing that the public and even many lawmakers didn't realize they were about to outlaw the very same cannabis sitting in their own pharmacies. And here's how that went. The committee brushed him off. Some members treated the most respected medical organization in America as an obstacle rather than an authority. The doctors had the facts. The propaganda had the momentum. The Marijuana Tax Act passed. It was signed into law in 1937. With the stroke of a pen, a medicine that had been on pharmacy shelves since before the Civil War was effectively erased. The doctors had warned exactly what would happen. They were ignored, and the consequences arrived quickly. In 1942, cannabis was quietly dropped from the United States Pharmacopeia, that official list of recognized medicines it had held a place in since 1850. Just like that, in the eyes of the government, it went from approved drug to nothing at all. The companies that made it stopped. The doctors who prescribed it moved on. An entire branch of medicine simply went dark, and the freeze didn't thaw, it got colder. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, the law that still organizes drugs in America today. Cannabis was placed in the harshest category of all, Schedule 1. By definition, Schedule 1 is reserved for substances with a high potential for abuse and, crucially, no accepted medical use whatsoever. The plant that William O'Shaughnessy studied, that Queen Victoria's doctor praised in print, that Eli Lilly, bottled by the ton, was now officially declared to have no medical value at all. It was placed in the same legal tier as heroin and treated as more dangerous than cocaine. Just 2 years later, in 1972, a government commission appointed by President Nixon himself studied the issue and recommended easing the penalties, suggesting the whole approach was overblown. The administration shelved the report and ignored it. The warning sign was right there. They drove past it on purpose. What followed were decades of frozen research, mass arrests, and lives derailed over a plant that had spent thousands of years as ordinary medicine. The fear that Anslinger and Hearst manufactured in the 1930s hardened into federal concrete that would take generations to crack. But concrete does crack. And by the end of the century, the story everyone had been told started falling apart in public. By the 1990s, the official line that cannabis had no medical use was getting harder and harder to defend. Patients with cancer, AIDS, chronic pain, and epilepsy were quietly insisting it helped them in ways nothing else could. In 1996, California broke ranks. Voters there passed Proposition 215, becoming the first state to legalize cannabis for medical use, in open defiance of federal law. It was a crack in the dam. And once the first crack appeared, the water came through fast. State after state followed, building their own medical programs, then their own recreational ones, year after year, vote after vote. Then the science the propaganda had buried finally got its day. In 2018, the United States Food and Drug Administration did something that would have been unthinkable under Anslinger. It approved a cannabis-derived medicine. The drug is called Epidiolex, made from a compound in the cannabis plant called cannabidiol, and it's prescribed for severe, treatment-resistant forms of childhood epilepsy. The seizures that O'Shaughnessy watched cannabis calm in the 1830s were now being treated by an FDA-approved cannabis drug in the 21st century. The medicine had come full circle. Today, around 40 states allow medical cannabis in some form. The plant that the federal government swore had no medical value is now legally prescribed to children across most of the country, which leaves the federal law itself looking less like protection and more like a relic. And as of just weeks ago, even that is finally starting to move. In December of 2025, the president signed an executive order pushing the government to fast-track a change that advocates had begged for across more than 50 years, moving cannabis out of that harshest Schedule 1 category. And in April of 2026, it actually happened, at least partway. The Justice Department and the Drug Enforcement Administration issued an order moving FDA-approved cannabis medicines and state-licensed medical marijuana from Schedule 1 down to Schedule 3. In plain terms, the federal government formally admitted what doctors had been saying since 1839. This plant has accepted medical use after all. But the story is not finished, not even close. Recreational cannabis, the kind sold in adult-use shops, is still sitting in Schedule 1 as you watch this. And right now, this very week, there's a federal hearing scheduled to begin on June 29, 2026, to decide whether to reschedule cannabis far more broadly. By law, that hearing is supposed to wrap up by the middle of July. So as these words reach you, the final chapter of a fight that started in a 1937 committee room is literally being argued in real time. Think about the full arc here. A medicine sold by your great-great-grandmother's pharmacist, renamed to make it frightening, buried by a man who needed a villain, erased from the official record, and now, almost 90 years later, slowly, awkwardly, being dug back up by the same government that buried it. The plant never changed. We did, twice. The next time you walk past a pharmacy and see those neat rows of approved, trusted bottles, remember that the line between medicine and menace was never really about chemistry. It was about who told the story, who profited from the fear, and who got ignored when they told the truth. If this is the kind of buried history you want more of, the everyday things hiding centuries of chaos, hit subscribe and stick around. There's a video on screen right now about another so-called ordinary thing that turns out to be anything but. Go watch it next.